I'm going to get you started by talking about the different parts of the drum kit and where the notation is written on the musical staff. Now, in case you've never learned anything about music, the musical staff are those 5 lines that appear horizontally across the page. This is where all your notes will be written so that you can identify what to play. Have a look at the staff that you see right now, and you'll see that there are little vertical lines that chop up that staff into what we call bars. Those little vertical lines, of course, are called bar lines. Now, what you need to know at this point is that each bar represents one cycle of counting. So we'll get more into that later. Now let's talk about the notation. Whenever you see notes that are written with a typical musical note head, that little black circle, that means drum. Now, well, let's start off with the highest drum, which is going to be your high tom. I have a 4-piece kit, so I just have one tom, and it'll be written on the top space of the musical staff. You might have more toms up here, and that's fine, but usually your main rack tom is that top space. Now, if you're playing a 5-piece kit and you have a second rack tom, then that note will appear on the line right below your high tom, and that makes sense because it sounds a little lower. The snare drum is probably the most important drum that you need to recognize because it appears in almost every exercise on every worksheet in every lesson. The snare is always written on the second space from the top. So anytime you see notes written there, you know where to play it. Finally, we have the floor tom. Most people just have one single floor tom, and if you do like me, then it's going to be written on the space below the snare drum. If you happen to have an extra tom here, or 2 floor toms, then you can write notes for one of them on the line just above that or below it. But typically the main floor tom is on the space below the snare drum. Now you'll notice that notes written for any of these drums always have the stems going up. And that's because you're using your hands to play them. That makes so much sense. But there's one more drum we haven't talked about, and that's the bass drum. The bass drum is always written on the bottom space of the musical staff, no matter what. Now on this website and lots of other sites and books and resources, you'll usually see notes for the bass drum written with the stem pointing down, because that means you're using your feet. That way you can separate your hands and your feet when you look at the notation. But sometimes you might come across some resources where those notes are also written up, connecting to everything else. If that's the case, it's still the bass drum. Regardless of what direction the stem goes in, you want to look for where the note is. So if it's on the bottom space, that's your bass drum. Now let's talk about the cymbals. You already know that drums are marked with a standard musical note head. But whenever you see a note that's written with an X, that means cymbal. So that's a really easy thing to distinguish. Now the hi-hats are probably the cymbals you're going to be playing most often, so let's start there. Notes for the hi-hats are going to be written right on top of the musical staff, just sitting above the top line. Anytime you see notes there, regardless of how you're playing the hi-hats, it's always going to appear in the same spot. The ride cymbal, which is another place where you'll be playing steady rhythms, is always written on the top line of the musical staff. So right there you can see a clear distinction. Space, line, and you want to get to know that. Finally, any crash cymbals you might have 1, you might have 2 or 3, they're always going to be written on a little ledger line, which is an extra line above the staff, just for that note. So when you see the X way up above there on a ledger line, then you know it's got to be a crash. Now, if you have more than one, it doesn't matter which crash you choose to play that note. It's just telling you that it's got to be a crash cymbal. So that pretty much covers the notation for the main parts of the drum kit. Of course, there are other things like the bell of the cymbal, the tambourine, cowbell, and you will get into that stuff as you go on into different lessons. But for now, this covers the basics. In the next video, I'm going to talk about rhythms. And this is really important because if you've never learned anything about music, you need to know what these basic rhythms are and what they mean. So I'm going to break down the notation so that you start to understand the timing behind the notes that you play.